Yeah. Great. Hello, Liz. We are getting now also some small chairs so that we maybe can collect a bit to sit still a bit nearer to the screen. Also because the light is somehow blurring a bit the projection. And let's see. So there are chairs. So if you want, you can take some and to be a bit closer here. Thank you, Liz, for being here. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for being so flexible also with our technical issues. What I'm very happy about is that you came here and we do this afternoon lecture, which is also kind of a specific date. And we positioned it like this also because later on there is a community college workshop planned. So you all agreed also to somehow see whether we can connect this lecture maybe then later with a workshop with some kind of experiments on exercises that somehow bring us closer to the topic of critically inquiring black boxes that are populating our lives. So this will be somehow the topic, and it will be about games, and you see balls lying around there, and we have some ideas that we would propose to people who want to participate later. And Liz, you will be part of it?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, Liz, just to introduce you a bit, Elizabeth Losh is a media theorist. She is a scholar of digital humanities and digital rhetoric. Actually, I noticed that rhetoric for me is not such a word that I'm familiar with. So maybe we can hear a bit what it actually is for the also German-speaking context. Currently, she's professor of English and American Studies at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. I saw that you studied, among other things, fine arts in creative writing.
Yes, I have a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing, yeah.
As well as English literature, if this is correct to say.
Correct.
With an emphasis on critical theory at Harvard University and the University of California at Irvine. She is also director of the Culture, Art and Technology program at the Thix College at the University of California in San Diego, where she also teaches in communication, visual arts, and interdisciplinary computing in the arts major. Then there is also the Equality Lab is at Williamsburg, yeah. So this is also kind of an institutional structure that you're engaging in very much. She is member of the editorial board of the journal Catalyst, Feminist Theory, Technoscience, and a founding member, which for me is very important, of FemTechNet, or for me is very interesting, which is a feminist network of scholars, artists, and activists known for its feminist decentralized pedagogy experiments, promoting collaborative research, pedagogy, and online learning innovations, also with a feminist perspective on all of these things. So a lot of methods, as I heard today, are online available also for
open access.
Yeah, for an access. In 2007, Liz Losh was awarded the John Lovers Memorial Wegblock Prize, which is commending rhetoric and composition via the open publishing tools of the internet. So you're very much engaged in the question of how rhetorics are transformed also with digital media and online media, online practices also of various users. Losh, your main areas of contribution are in interrogating the assumptions embedded in the rhetorics of news, fake news also, information and pedagogy in digital media platforms and projects, particularly within online cultures and where online cultures intersect with spaces like classroom and institutions like journalism. So there's a lot about also intersecting with the analog world or you are the author of books including 2009 Virtualpolitik. It's German because
it's a take on Realpolitik.
Okay.
But instead thinking about electronic government.
Yeah, but so Realpolitik, because it's written like in the German.
Yes, that's because I'm arguing that that e-government, because it's both a regulator and a content creator, has to do all of this sort of strategic power balancing.
Okay. So Virtualpolitik, an electronic history of government media making in a time of war, scandal, disaster, miscommunication, and mistakes. And in 2014, she published The War on Learning, Gaining Ground in the Digital University. Together with Jonathan Alexander, she published Understanding Rhetoric, a guide to writing that introduces graphics and comic drawings as a means of doing pedagogy. And you are the co-author of Bodies of Information, Intersectional Feminism and Digital Humanities. Your current work in progress focuses on computing in the White House, in the Obama and Trump administrations. Yeah, and you are, it's possible to see lectures by you on YouTube, and you're also kind of weblogging or blogging.
Yeah, I don't blog anymore, but you could definitely find lots of stuff I wrote online.
Which I really recommend to look for, because it's kind of entertaining also to see you talk and promote the stuff you're promoting. Many funny stories also going on in your talks. And I found a quote that I just want to put up here, and you will recall it then for the workshop, because it was, for me, quite nicely. It is a quote from a talk that you gave on cheating in learning, like cheating on exams, and how there are YouTube tutorials exchanging on how to better cheat in exams, and on all of kinds of informational educational practices, also how this is inspired by game culture, digital game culture. And I found that a quote, "Subverting a complex system is often the best way to understand its rules." And this we will take in the workshop later, yes. But maybe we encounter it also now.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for that wonderful introduction. Yay. Thanks so much to the curators and all the other people who have made this such a wonderful day. And thank you for the people who solved the technical difficulties as well. That's wonderful. So in September, I have a book coming out called Hashtag. And it's about the role of metadata in our daily lives. So it's also concerned with some of these black box systems and the ways that machine-to-machine communication and human-to-human communication sometimes work at odds with each other. It's part of the Object Lessons series that's, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Object Lessons. The idea is that people essentially write a long, book-length philosophical essay about an everyday object, and that can include digital objects. So perhaps in the Q&A we can talk a little bit about other kinds of non-human agents in our daily lives and the ways that black box systems, including things that appear to be very visible and easy to use, like hashtags, can have more complicated histories. I'm delighted to be here in connection with hysterical mining. I think you'll see that in terms of my own background in feminist science and technology studies and feminist media arts practice, that there are a certain number of overlaps. I'm, as Andrea mentioned, a former co-facilitator and a founding member of a feminist collective called FemTechNet. And to sort of understand what FemTechNet does, I think it's helpful to talk about its theoretical touchstones. And I think these are a lot of the same touchstones that come up in the exhibition as well. So for example, feminists in this group are interested in how technology is material, although it's often presented as either transcendent or virtual. How technology involves embodiment, although it's often presented as disembodied. So earlier on we were talking about how use of the mobile phones might sort of reconfigure your muscles and skeleton. And so in that way, this sort of disembodied wireless technology that's connecting with the cloud is still very much shaping your body. Technology solicits affect, although it's often presented as highly rational, so that we have all these affective, emotional engagements with our technologies, even though they're supposed to make us less emotional, more sensible, more rational. Technology requires labor, although it's often presented as labor saving, and of course that's something that feminists are often interested in, is all of the different kinds of invisible labor. And so in what ways do our technologies perhaps they don't actually save labor, they might create more labor, and they might move that labor to places that we don't see. So for example, content moderators in the Philippines, or the labor of the people who are assembling computer chips in factories far away, so that the seeming labor-saving device actually involves a lot of labor of different human agents. Technology is situated in particular contexts, although it's often presented as universal. It promotes particular values, although it's often presented as neutral. And it expects mastery of certain tacit knowledge practices, although it's often presented as transparent. So the assumption that an easy-to-use technology, that you can open it up out of the box and know how to use it, assumes that you already have a history of tacit knowledge that you've gained over a lifetime that might not necessarily be universally shared. So these are some of the kind of fundamental philosophical principles that people in the network have kind of agreed to share. And in our book, Bodies of Information, Intersectional Feminism and Digital Humanities, we revisit a lot of these themes as a way to kind of organize our thoughts, because we think that there's this strong sense of Silicon Valley invention myths that want us to believe that technology is always sort of friction-free, and we're really interested in sort of paying attention to those sources of friction. And if you need to remember this list of things, you can just use the acronym TV Meals, MEALS, as a way to remember it. So I think one thing that's important to do in feminist practice is acknowledge the fact that one's knowledge is not only a product of your own experiences, that knowledge is co-created, and that it's particularly created by being in conversation with others. So I'd like to start this talk by acknowledging some of the people who've been important in shaping a lot of the ideas that I'll be talking about today. So first, I'd like to thank the other co-facilitators of FemTechNet. So that's Alexandra, so starting on the upper left-hand corner, that's Alexandra Juhas, Ann Balsamo, Lisa Nakamura, Sharon Irish, and Paula Gardner. And then in the second row, Jasmine Rault, T.L. Cohen, Veronica Paredes, and Ann Kong Nguyen. And then Ann Kong Nguyen has also been my co-teacher for the Feminist Digital Humanities Summer Institute. Other co-teachers are Jessica Marie Johnson, who's on the middle right-hand side. And then on the bottom, Jacqueline Wernemont, who is frequently my co-author and co-editor. The woman in the scarf is Lisa Cartwright, who is my co-instructor in FemTechNet. Below her is Celia Pierce, who co-edits the media origin stories with me. Beth Coleman and I worked together on the Media Activism Project, as did Sam Gregory. And finally, in the corner, Jonathan Alexander, who is the co-author of Understanding Rhetoric. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge those people just as a kind of opening ritual. I sent along some links that might also be helpful for thinking about how to talk about machine vision in a feminist context. Guido Sterl's How Not to Be Seen, a Fucking Didactic MOV File, is the full title, which talks about how we can think about how non-human agents are viewing us from the air, and the satellite vision of the non-human that we participate in. And Guido Sterl's piece is interesting because she keeps drawing attention to how calibration is very important, and how these devices to calibrate these technologies, often these large-scale grids in the desert, can be important in determining what is seen and what is not seen, how invisibility is negotiated. Another link I sent along was by Joy Bolamwini of MIT, who has done a lot of activist work around the assumed whiteness of users of facial recognition technologies. She, in fact, created a piece where the algorithm could only see her if she was wearing a white mask. And the video I sent a link to is called AI Ain't I a Woman? And it shows prominent black women, particularly black feminists, that machine recognition algorithms usually identify as male. So read the features of African Americans as being men. And so she sort of draws attention to how AI make certain normative assumptions about race and gender. It's Joy Buolamwini, Buolamwini. And I also mentioned a third link, which is from Jill Walker-Retberg, who's the director of the Machine Vision and Everyday Life project at the University of Bergen, and another important collaborator of mine, where she talks about how we can think about surveillance capitalism and biometric grids in relationship to our mobile phones, and the ways that using something like Snapchat is also a way of participating in certain kind of biometrical regimes. Together, we designed a unit, data valence, biometric, and facial recognition. It's designed to have exercises and readings for students in an open access format. So the idea is, how can you talk about these topics in ways that are more accessible, particularly since, so how many of you actually take selfies on, at least a once a month basis? Yeah. Okay, so we at least got some selfie takers here. All right. So we were interested in how to take a common digital practice and use it as an avenue for talking about topics, about black boxed algorithms that might not necessarily be something that people are familiar with. And it's part of a larger international cooperation called the Selfie Course, where we designed an open access course on selfies. So I have a more formal lecture that is divided between two parts. And the first part is going to be a more traditional lecture, and the second part is going to be a little wacky, because the second part is growing out of this Machine Vision and Everyday Life project. So the assumption is that we're in the 2050s, and we're a group of academics looking back at the past and all of the things that have happened in the intervening 30 years, and how theoreticians, media theorists, are trying to make sense of the ways that machine vision has now completely reshaped all of the ways that we interact with each other and with our environment. So, but the first half will be a little straighter. So here I go. So the camera opens on a group of musicians preparing to play a string quartet by Debussy. As the music swells from their instruments, rectangles appear and begin to follow their faces. Guesses from biometric algorithms flicker over the circle of players, trying to classify the musicians by sex, age, and current mood. The system is clearly fallible, shifting between genders as musicians turn their heads and cycling through wildly improbable ages with each changing expression. Soon, frames appear all over the scene. A female violinist is identified incorrectly as a black chair with a red umbrella. A stand with sheet music is mistagged as a white wooden table. Clearly, the computer is struggling to make sense of complex moving images using its training data to interpret the patterns it thinks it perceives. As the film by the artist Trevor Paglen progresses, the computer vision becomes more abstract, and the images are captured by software progressively more divorced from the domains of human sight. The viewer is now watching the performers through algorithms used in self-driving cars, guided missiles, and aerial drones. Although this footage might seem bizarre and otherworldly, it's important to remember that today words and images are much more likely to be read or viewed by machines than by human beings, as enormous quantities of data are filtered, correlated, aggregated, and sorted by algorithms designed for digital archives, search engine portals, social network sites, and systems policing intellectual property, national security, public safety, civic propriety, medical normality, and gender conformity. Use of these algorithms as a substitute for human interpreters tends to raise many anxieties, particularly among those who worry either about omnipresent surveillance or about a total abdication of oversight possible in the very near future. And it was interesting, actually, this scanning technology, which is widely used in the United States, and as I noticed, more and more in use here in Europe. Just as I was flying here, there was a kind of prepubescent boy who kept sort of having to go through the scanner because the machine sort of, he had long hair and it somehow didn't know what his gender was, even though he seemed to know what his gender was. So in September of 2018, I visited one of the offices of SenseTime at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Using machine learning algorithms and training data derived from the profiles of over 1 billion Chinese citizens, SenseTime's promises that misbehavior could be eliminated along with anonymity. I thought they would be suspicious of my curiosity, but they boasted about their achievements in large-scale public surveillance, in which no one on the street would be an unknown agent. And now the people at SenseTime talk about what they call now the 1% problem, is that for a long time, machine vision was 90% accurate, and now they've reached the 99% threshold in terms of the accuracy of the machine vision facial recognition technology. And so the question is kind of, where does that 1% matter? Where does the being wrong 1% of the time? And they're getting closer now to 0.1%, where they're thinking that, oh, well, that'll make it rare enough that we can really deploy a lot of these systems in large-scale use. So, in fact, during my tour, they appealed to my identity as a college instructor. Apparently, SenseTime could automate taking attendance in the classroom or lecture hall, thereby freeing up faculty for higher-order tasks by using the same software used to identify shoplifters in a mall. The company's products could also identify students who were inattentive or sleepy, using the same algorithms being tested on the faces of drivers in city traffic. So the next picture. So another one of Paglen's work, and this is really hard to see in the light, unfortunately, is a black and white silver gelatin print of Shoshone Falls, an expanse of sublime nature representing the American West that was captured in the lens of Timothy O'Sullivan in 1874. In Paglen's version of the waterfall, 2 different computer vision technologies have been applied: a program to recognize faces and one to demarcate road boundaries. So you can't, go back, let's see if I can go. Yeah, on this, with this light, you can't really see it, but it hallucinates, like it thinks it sees a face in the waterfall and it's put a little box around it, and then it thinks it sees another face over there. And so it's finding these faces that aren't really there, and it's also finding roads that aren't really there. Thus, the placid image hints at 2 radically opposed nightmares about computer vision: a dystopian environment of constant monitoring with no sanctuaries of privacy, or an equally dysfunctional world of self-driving cars running amok, haphazard medical diagnoses, and other attempts to automate the labor of preserving safety and health. Between the Scylla and Charybdis of surveillance and abdicated oversight, how are humanists, artists, educators, and citizens supposed to navigate the contemporary machine vision landscape? So next slide. So critics have argued that the last great technological change in visual culture during the early modern period connected the sciences and the humanities closely, as humanist thinkers considered the philosophical, aesthetic, and cultural ramifications of techniques for representing linear perspective and anatomical proportions, and optical devices like the camera obscura, the microscope, and the telescope. Interacting with biometric grids has become a normal part of day-to-day communication for many people, often as a way to try on new identities or engage in performance and play. How many of you have tried one of these like face swapping programs? Okay, more people have done that. All right. At the same time, we are assured that machine vision systems will liberate us from the burdensome objects of contemporary authentication. We will be able to reboard cruise ships in foreign ports without cumbersome identifying documents, and open doors without heavy rings of keys. Handing off the door keys, see, you just need a machine vision system there. Yet remarkably little has been written in the humanities, even in the digital humanities, about machine vision. However, now that massive cloud storage systems, cloud storage services that commonly back up mobile devices may be categorizing personal images unasked, we need to ask questions about how those sorting systems operate. As Safia Noble has pointed out, what she calls algorithms of oppression may be creating new systems of digital red lighting in the backgrounds of our computationally mediated daily lives, particularly when people of color are tagged with hurtful racist stereotypes or excluded from participation by authentication systems that privilege whiteness. We need to ask substantive moral, ethical, existential, metaphysical, and ontological philosophical questions. So in this case, someone's image sorting algorithm on their cell phone decided that they and their friends should go under a category marked gorillas. So this is the kind of automated sorting that's going on just in daily life. Of course, digital artists who are mindful of the power of non-human agents to serve as judge, jury, and arbiter of truth in the age of computer vision, machine learning, and black-boxed algorithms have produced a number of works in addition to the videos that I've suggested as recommended viewing for today's conversation. As a gay man wary of claims that machine vision can purportedly identify the visible differences between homosexuals and heterosexuals in their social media profiles, Zach Blass, and the next slide shows the pictures. So you can see he's created these devices that will frustrate facial recognition algorithms. As a gay man wary of claims that machine vision can purportedly identify the visible differences between homosexuals and heterosexuals, Zach Blass has articulated a range of responses to these new surveillance regimes. As a creator of so-called queer technologies, Blass has crafted a series of face cages, otherworldly facial jewelry that confuses attempts to harvest biometric grids, which are modeled by Blass and other queer digital artists. So here you can see a group of artists wearing his face mask. Next slide. And if there's actually a play button on this, let's see if it. No, it's not coming. Oh, there it is. Okay. In contrast, Raphael Lozano Hemmer celebrates the tirelessness of machine vision scrutiny, that it can search for those lost to the social world long after human beings give up on their quest for their departed. In his 2015 work, Level of Confidence, the system tries to see if the viewer might match one of the 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Normalista School in Iguala, Guerrero, Mexico, who disappeared in a mysterious mass kidnapping in 2014, a case that the government has treated as impossible to solve. So in this case, you can see the viewer to the exhibit is being, the database of faces is being searched through, and as she moves her face, it's trying to sort of match her to one of the students. So next slide. Creators of digital literature are also exploring the ways that computer vision could enhance experiences of reading and writing. Tablets, smartphones, and goggles that are equipped with built-in cameras, capable of recognizing input from their environments, offer writers new ways to reimagine the book or codex and conceptualize a new generation of reading machines. For example, thank you so much. Amaranth Boursouk's Between Page and Screen, which was published in 2012, investigates the place of books as objects in an era of increasingly screen-based reading. The actual pages of this artist's books contain no legible text. The reader is presented with only abstract geometrical patterns and a URL leading to a website, where the book may be read using any browser and webcam. Between page and screen is an epistolary work, a work made up of letters, in which there's a series of letters written by two lovers. So P is page and S is screen, and they have this sort of romance between each other, and they're kind of writing these plaintive letters back and forth to each other. Two lovers, quote, struggling to map the boundaries of their relationship, contested territory that does not exist on either page or screen, but in the augmented space between them opened up by the reader, end quote. Borsuk claims to draw inspiration from the concept of projective mediumship in the work of the poet H.G. The letters are full of homophones, puns, sight rhymes, and linguistic play with the etymologies of the word page and screen. Sometimes the addressee is P for page, and sometimes it is S for screen, and there are also a number of interludes in which concrete poetry occupies the 3D space that the reader inhabits. Indeed, the reader cannot disappear from the text that he or she is engaged in reading because it's difficult to elude the gaze of the webcam while holding up one's copy of the book. Thus, the kinetic typography floating in the 3D space between page and screen almost inevitably includes the human subject in the reading environment. Fans of the work can print out their own books with their own augmented reality text using a DIY toolkit on the website. Caitlin Fisher's Circle speaks very intimately to the listener in a voice of intensely personal lyricism, sometimes in a whisper. Fisher defines Circle as an augmented reality tabletop theater piece that deploys the iPad or smartphone in a private setting. The device is used to sense appropriate input cues from an assemblage of miscellaneous scrapbook-style mementos stocked in a small trunk. Circle tells the story of 3 generations of women through haunting voiceovers. It includes a plaintive tale of disappearing parents told by an orphan child whose parents, quote, parents went on holiday to Morocco in 1967 and don't come back, end quote. Nostalgic refrains run through the piece such as, they won't come back, they might come back, they don't come back. Fisher is known for conceptualizing her work as adult forms of children's pop-up books, in which the reading machine is triggered by cryptic symbolic markers. The initial version of Circle was created using a custom marker tracking system so that users interacted with the piece by hovering over the markers with a webcam and triggering audio and video content. To read the photos, scraps from the nursery, family travelogues, and other ephemeral documents, a later system utilized Unity and natural feature tracking, so the jarringly incongruous black and white coded markers clearly intended for machine interpretation could be replaced by naturalistic objects and photos that might seem more aesthetically harmonious. Finally, writer Judd Morrissey collaborated with the choreographer Mark Jeffrey to stage the Appropriation, which was described as the Adam R for anatomical theater of mixed reality. Morrissey's Operature combined live performance and an augmented reality poem that highlights anatomical science and spectacle. So dancers wore temporary tattoos that could be read by the surveilling apparatus. So in other words, the dancers in the piece were wearing these tattoos that then when you put the iPad over the tattoo, text would appear, and the text could actually be sort of projected into the space. So it was a sort of nice way that you were able to kind of read the body with this with the computer vision that was in the iPad and the screen. The dance movements were punctuated with iPad interludes on which inscribed body parts were examined by the scanning technologies of the device. Otherwise, hidden content was revealed in the detective work of assaying a kind of crime scene in which the dancers' bodies were often presented as inert objects to be autopsied. For instance, with the aid of an iPhone in the hands of a skilled performer playing investigator, scenes from a Kenneth Anger film, play, or coded stud files appear. Morrissey described the Operature as, quote, a provisional collective exploring forensics, anatomy, and 21st century embodiment through performance, language, and emerging technologies, end quote. The tattooed images on the dancers' bodies included realistic cross-sections of organs from medical illustrations and stylized depictions of hands and flowers from folk art. The interaction between the reading machine and the computer-readable text generated both a homoerotic reading of the bodily landscape and the digitally mediated output of technocratic knowledges. All three feminist writers, Morrissey, Fisher, and Borsuk, not only remediated forms of print culture generally considered far beyond the margins of mass-market book production, but also allowed the reading machine to occupy the position of first viewer, often in front of the human one. With the new generation of reading machines that can perceive contrast relationships in a 2D visual environment, sensors can read the ink of tattoos, the grain of family artifacts, and the code of numbered artist books or print-at-home emulation. Next slide. Bethany Nowitzki has celebrated the potential of such advanced visual recognition algorithms as a potential boon to scholars of the environmental humanities, who will be able to mine the millions of images in the Biodiversity Heritage Library that are drawn from centuries of gorgeous notebook sketches and lavish book illustrations. From the perspective of my own campus, William and Mary, I get to see an international team of faculty, librarians, and students undertaking the daunting task of interpreting and curating over 300,000 pages of archival materials from the British Royal Archives to produce the Georgian Papers program, an ambitious digital humanities project aimed at analyzing a complex era of exploration, colonialism, cultural diffusion, and revolution, with primary sources that include essays, letters, reports, inventories, recipe books, menus, and didactic material for the children of the royal family. Some tasks can be made more manageable by using Transcribus, a cursive writing recognition tool that can be trained on a sample of the individual's handwriting. Although many of the manuscript pages with the script of George III show his erratic state of mind during periods of mental disorder, and if you'll remember, George III was famously called the Mad King. The large samples available with his penmanship unaffected make it possible to automatically code large collections with his handwritten documents. Next slide. So rather than study the static paper documents that memorialize the Georgian kings, I scrutinize multimedia digital artifacts that compose the records of today's political leaders. And this goes back to Andrea's question about how I'm defining rhetoric and why I think that the connection between the computer vision and rhetoric might matter. New computationals, as channels for content multiply, so as we have political leaders, say on sites like YouTube or Twitter, and you have something like, Trump's 37,000 tweets to go through. It's another kind of text mining that you might do. New computational and visualization techniques can foster new forms of humanities scholarship and public access to historical records. Now that the speeches of contemporary political leaders are recorded and archived, humanists have a rich record of public rhetoric to analyze that includes facial expressions, bodily gesture, vocal performance, and frequently the use of sets and props. In the era of digital video, new editing and compositing techniques are also part of the official version of a given speech. And portions of these speeches may be further edited and composited when they appear as part of news broadcasts. Broadcasters may adopt signature visual styles that brand their programs, which may even signal the political orientation of the shows. And these markers of visual rhetoric can be mapped over time or represented comparatively. Scholars in the field of rhetoric, performance studies, history, journalism, film and media studies, and civic education can compare and contrast visual and verbal political messages and changes over time in large digital video collections. So for example, the leaked video of the Mallorca conversations might be fun to do some machine vision with this stuff and sort of see what kind of gesture analysis we could do and facial expression analysis. International archives of contemporary news broadcasts present these clips of historical figures in the public record in increasingly visually complex ways that use massive collections of heterogeneous and frequently unsourced footage, including studio shots of anchors, field reporting, stock footage used for B-roll, video news releases, government public records, public relations material, and witness journalism from cell phones and mobile devices. Moreover, all of this video content may also be combined with motion graphics and digital effects. Although I am cautious, so this is me in the software studies lab working with facial recognition technology, working with the archive of Obama's weekly YouTube addresses, trying to kind of sort through this large archive of video material and try to see how it could be categorized. Although I'm cautious, I'm curious about using machine vision technology in my own research on digital rhetoric and incorporating it into my teaching to help students interpret complex moving images. Visual rhetoric has a long tradition in the history of the humanities that includes analysis of symbolic objects in portraits of world leaders or the choreography of their oratorical performances. This approach to digital humanities can be integrated into more traditional rhetorical analysis because elected office holders also produce memoirs, letters, editorials, and other forms of written discourse. Speaking personally, I want to acknowledge the fact that machine vision may open up new forms of collaboration, new ways to approach our objects of study, and new evidence for arguments that can enhance our civic understanding. And that's the end of part 1. And here's part 2. This on the left is Annette Markham, who is my co-author. And on the right, these are people who are in the Bergen Machine Vision in Everyday Life group. All right, so this is from chapter 10 of a book we've written in the future called Optical Nostalgia, The Pursuit of What Never Was. And there's an introduction to the excerpts from the editors at the beginning. And so here we go. So we are nostalgic for the golden age of seeing, now that that equation between I and I has ended. After dramatic cataclysms in our cultural values, political systems, economic opportunities, and ecological conditions, our privileged former status as lone sentient observers has been appropriated by increasingly sophisticated technologies. As our human exceptionalism has been challenged and our visual sovereignty has been curtailed, we long to return to the past. However, in our current state of fetishizing lost, we've forgotten that the optical era wasn't perfectly equitable, authentic, natural, or unmediated. Furthermore, despite radical transformations and advancements in state-of-the-art perceptual sensing, many academic treatments of perception, sensing, and ways of knowing continue to cling to older conceptual metaphors, such as the aperture or the screen. In this chapter, we excerpt segments from 2 major works emerging from the Bergen School of Machine Vision. One is the early landmark book, Optical Nostalgia, by Abelardo, Losh, Markham, and Tildenberg, which was published in 2022 by MIT Press. And the second is their retrospective corrective history of the origins of machine sense and sensibility, the 2052 book, Where AI Found the Fourth Dimension, which was by Abelardo, Losh, Markham, and Tildenberg, available as a non-injection print copy. We point to both texts as bringing attention to several convergences in the early 2020s. In the first excerpt, we note the prescient quality of the early Bergen School. Optical Nostalgia highlighted that the golden age of seeing was misguided, imagined, and idealized. This book traced and mapped the contours of the post-optical in a theoretically nuanced and privileged and productive way. In the older logic of ocular theory, optics were privileged over sensors, cameras were privileged over scanners, and representation was privileged over registration. As these authors argued in 2022, this nostalgia prevented us from any radical transformation in letting machines see differently from that which is humanly possible. In the second excerpt, we offer the retrospective study of the contributions of the Bergen School in When AI Found the Fourth Dimension. This work sketches the complex history of the origins of the rhythm turn, as well as events that led to the development of a greater sense continuum involving detection of auras. Editorial comment on optical nostalgia. Other titles in the field in the 2020s and 2030s were less about optical nostalgia than about optical collapse or optical extinction. A sense that the 21st century cult of data images overloaded the media ecology with a flood of user-generated content, too massive for human processing. In contrast, Abelard, Losh, Markham, and Tildenberg adopted a pragmatic tone, much like Zygmunt Baumann's commentary on the perceptions of lost community, in that they pointed out that what we experienced as a loss of visual culture was actually a nostalgia for something that never existed as such, a nostalgia for a sentimental ideal. They draw attention to the fact that the optical era technologies were never a natural or neutral representation of the real. They offer an acknowledgement that technology was always integral to the optical era sensing and sense-making. In common discourse, there has been an uncontested claim that there was a huge paradigm shift from optical media to digital media, but they trace the use of numerical identifiers and external apparatuses all through the history of perception. In this book, they also therefore make a more nuanced argument about the optical. The perceptual apparatus has always been mediated, which can be shown by tracing distortions through different genealogies of technologies for mediation, including mirrors, lenses, filters, and neural networks. This groundbreaking first book adopted a three-pronged approach. First, they offered a genealogy of data-driven sensing from the early 21st century to show the continuities in technologically mediated perception. To this, they added a critical analysis of these forms, practices, and traditions of visual perceptions in the earlier golden age of seeing, to show that how there had not been a radical epistemic disjunction, but rather a series of more gradual shifts. Lastly, they called for finally dismissing the Eurocentrism of existing paradigms by situating these transitions more globally. The loss experienced by Europe had long been argued as a period of liberation by other regions of the world. They explored differences in technological developments, patterns of cultural acceptance, and predominant narratives explaining the meaning or values of the post-optical turn, focusing on China, the Americas, Africa, and Europe. With this book, they finally closed Alberti's window, which had been ajar for 6 centuries. And so this next section is supposedly part of the 3rd chapter of Optical Nostalgia. The history of mediated visuality begins with a reversal. The rupture occurs when the left-right orientation of the human face was first seen flipped in a mirror. Those who imagined human prehistory might depict this as a moment of interaction with a naturally reflective medium like water, when primitive hominids first saw their reflective faces. This first duplicated human might have been delighted with her aqueous double like Narcissus, and then the next slide, or appalled like Frankenstein's monster. Whatever the reaction of this early human to her double, this mirror stage of human development is assumed to be fundamental to identity formation, and mirror neurons are supposed to be basic components of the brains of higher mammals. All media technologies, such as the mirror, which enable self-representation, make some things visible and others invisible, and focus some details and blur others. They distort. When Shakespeare wrote, "Thou art thy mother's glass," to his reader, he imagines a parent looking at a child and seeing her own reflection, but the representation is always backwards in some way. One of us has a memory from childhood at a science museum in California. A machine vision installation sends data from 2 capture devices to 2 screens. One camera can only see stationary objects, and the other camera can only see objects in motion. A child waving her arms appears without arms in one screen and as disembodied, frantically moving arms in another. Machine vision is a mirror of partial capture. Let's remember that imaging technologies have always been toxic. Historically, in creating media technologies, enterprising humans destroyed as well as created. To craft mirrors of volcanic glass, bronze, and copper, natural resources had to be excavated and mined. The mercury silvering of the early modern period was a revolutionary technology with toxic side effects. Other kinds of seeing that make the invisible visible could also be hazardous, like X-ray machines that allowed World War I surgeons to finally see the bones inside of their patients. Optical lenses used in eyeglasses, telescopes, and microscopes were also important pre-computational mediating technologies that augmented human sight. The medievalist Jonathan Shee has argued that eyeglasses serve as a technological apparatus that also reveal fundamental ideologies about disability and blindness. Some might object that these early optical technologies were fundamentally different from those involving translating data into images and back again. For example, in his work on technical images, Wilhelm Flusser argues that the early history of art, ranging from cave paintings to the products of the camera obscura, followed the logic of conventional depiction. With the advent of numerical systems of representation and simulation, quote, rules for computing or algorithms on optical systems, signals, end quote, could just as easily be applied, quote, in acoustics or cryptography because they are perfectly indifferent toward medial contents or sensory fields, end quote. In other words, the data from an oil painting can be encoded into a series of zeros and ones and then recorded into the matrix of a thumb drive for display on a laptop screen. N. Catherine Hales describes a similar agnosticism once informational patterns can be abstracted from any material substrate, a moment that Hales describes as when information lost its body during the era of cybernetics. Even the binary oppositions of neural operations can be encoded to be visualized, sonified, and reified once divorced from the corporeality of the individual. And this is from Pierre Huyg's Umwelt. Of course, the relationship between data and images predates digital computing. We may mourn the closing of Alberti's window, but his scheme of linear perspective transformed drawing into a computational practice. Once compositions could be mathematically derived and body proportions numerically calculated, the naive view was already lost. The alchemical magic of filtering in photography predates the digital filters of Snapchat and Instagram, but the ratio of chemicals or the formulations of processes were mathematically determined image-altering technologies as well. Light serves as a catalyst to create the luminous Sabatier effects in a Man Ray photograph as part of a precise darkroom repertoire. And this is work created by a group called ScanLab in the UK that often show how machine vision sees these hallucinations, particularly when it imagines rooms that actually aren't there. And this is actually a work that they're doing about refugees in urban life. A number of powers in the late 20th century gathered together to tackle the problem of automating metadata tagging for massive archives of visual culture. At some professional gatherings, including the 2011 DMASM conference at UC San Diego, representatives of cultural heritage, state security, and intellectual property regulation, representing the movie and recording industries, congregated to share knowledge about ways to categorize images, videos, and sound archives from user-generated content in the wild. Low-status outsourced labor often performed tasks too complicated for a machine, such as telling the difference between fingers and French fries, nipples and stickers, a lion and grass. After all, as Ludwig Wittgenstein observed in the Blue and Brown books, even the resemblance of faces is difficult to explain logically when speaking of faces of members of the same family. To perform the task of identification, contemporary machine vision technologies capture more than static images. Companies patent inventions for gait tracking on the assumption that human rhythm is as distinct as human rhyme. And so, for example, like if you're watching a bird fly, like its particular pattern of rhythmic movement is distinctive to the bird. Or if you're watching a human being walk, that rhythm is distinctive. And even the rhythm of someone typing, there are algorithms that can identify the user. And actually, if you look back to the 19th century, when people used the telegraph, people could identify the individual telegraph operator just by the rhythm of the keys. So the sense that it's not just your appearance that makes you you, it's also that your rhythm is something that machines are capturing. So, of course, this is not as much of a novelty as it might seem. Quantifying gesture has been a staple for centuries in rhetorical manuals, most famously in Gilbert Austin's Chronomia, that shows a human figure transcribed in a segmented 3D sphere. As scientists expand optical storage media to include biological matter, the loop of Muybridge's horse that inspired zoetrope wonder in ages past can now be encoded as a GIF file stored in fragments of DNA. And unfortunately, I couldn't get this to run on the slide, but this GIF file is kind of amazing because it's actually, it's a DNA fragment that's been separated using the CRISPR technology and then re-encoded as a GIF, and they used Muybridge's horse, so it's kind of cool. Okay, so this is one other imagined chapter. In the early 21st century, legislators struggled with ceding the ground of human agencies to machine. The Hong Kong-based company SenseTime, which celebrated how machine vision could be used to monitor petty criminals, track student attendance, and surveil sleepy or distracted drivers, partnered with US universities and corporations in its heyday. It was also the same company that undertook a massive racial profiling project of ethnic Uyghurs in China to apply predictive policing to the country's Muslim minority. In addition to identifying the faces of individuals, the software was designed to categorize ethnic types using biometrics in a 21st century vision of 20th century racial science and 19th century phrenology and anthropometry. In response, the US federal government introduced H.R. 649, which condemned China's actions, and at the local level, in May of 2019, the city of San Francisco passed a measure banning facial recognition technologies in public places by an 8-to-1 vote. Yet with smartphones and social network companies already sorting visual content with machine vision algorithms already intimately connected to every citizen in the world, how could political institutions keep up? In some ways, suspicions over self-driving cars and concerns about automating analysis of medical imaging seem less abstract to many citizens than more nebulous Orwellian privacy concerns, particularly after automated software systems caused 2 737 MAX airplanes to crash shortly after takeoff, despite the furious attempts of pilots. Concerns about legal liability of myopic machines left obvious wreckage behind, like the female bicyclist killed in 2018 by a self-driving car. Yet questions of blame seem to become impossibly complex with machine vision, even in obviously egregious cases. Ironically, humanitarian concerns propelled some of the most important advances in machine vision developed for gatekeeping. Some of the push for advanced machine vision came from activists concerned about outsourcing unpleasant digital labor to the Philippines and other high-poverty countries. So, last section? All right. So this is from the final section of this imagined anthology. So in this chapter, we discuss some of the key transformation of the rhythm turn, focusing specifically on the early Bergen School of Tesseract, transitional study of social entities and rhythm interaction. We argue that the convergence of various AI systems around rhythms and echolocations marked a turning point, what Gregory Bateson a century ago called a difference that makes a difference. This convergence, especially as it occurred across multiple technology development sectors simultaneously, finally spurred cultural influencers to look away from the optical illusion. We end this chapter by challenging those lingering schools of thought that continue to privilege visual sense-making, despite the grave environmental toll of superfluous screens and the precision of non-human sensing technologies. The process of aesthetic exploration began as machine vision and listening technologies on mobile phones were perceived as increasingly banal. Online beauty tutorials could apply makeup from magazines to the faces of young women with tablet technology. Next one. By 2023, augmented reality technologies used to aid travelers, citizen scientists, and amateur historians could identify any language, musical refrain, species in the natural environment, geological formation, model of vehicle, architectural style, and fashion brand. Machine taste and machine smell were widely used to improve the food industry and to identify noxious environmental conditions, including hazardous waste dumps and forest fires in remote locations. Because the industry of online pornography has often been a driver for technological innovation, machine touch that could convey information about the textures and frictional surfaces of skin and bodily fluids made machine touch on mobile phones extremely popular by the 2030s. Soon, machine sensing technologies would begin to gather data from the interaction of senses rather than merely replicate information from a single sense in isolation. The most obvious of these mislocations, as we argued, even starting in the 2020s, was in the way that contemporary technologies attempted to combine 5 senses to simulate the whole sense experience. This has been depicted in stirring accounts and interactive exhibitions. Synesthesia comes from the Greek syn, together, and aisthanai, to perceive. In the early 21st century, this concept was commonly used to explain those perceptions that could not be explained by any one of the 5 senses alone: hearing, touch, taste, smell, and feel. Synesthesia was used to explain gut instincts, hunches, women's instincts, as well as the phenomena of seeing musical tones, numbers, or vowel sounds as colors. Research on sensory perception has long been based on the idea that the senses are species-specific. As Diane Ackerman put it, quote, "Species evolve sense fine-tuned for different programs of survival. It's impossible to put ourselves into the sensory realm of any other species. We've evolved unique ways of perceiving the world to cope with the demands of our environment. Physics sets the limit," end quote. The limits of physics turned out to be more a limit of human imagination to acknowledge and describe the perceptual processes of machines. Through dense sensor arrays, algorithmic systems, enormous data processing power, augmented by their capacity to draw on massive sets of aggregated data. Once we started attending to the excesses or anomalies produced through AI, a cascade of new senses seemed to emerge. In just a few years, the so-called sixth sense, synesthesia, was understood to be a mere metonym that grouped together and simplified multiple perceptual abilities, that a scientific understanding of the way external stimuli was transformed into information by the sensing entity. Many authors followed by developing critiques of synesthesia as the sixth sense. To explain this paradigm shift in somewhat more detail, we trace some of the parallel strands of early machine vision studies that pinpointed 2 new senses: the 7th sense, aura, and the 8th sense, rhythm. Next slide. Of course, as the theorist Walter Benjamin argued, the aura of an original object would seem to be resistant to capture by a technological apparatus, as he argued in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. This is from Walter Benjamin. One might subsume the eliminated element in the term aura and go on to say that which withers in the age of mechanical reproduction is an aura of the work of art. This is a symptomatic process whose significance points beyond the realm of art. One might generalize by saying the technique of reproduction detaches the reproduced object from the domain of tradition. By making many reproductions, it substitutes a plurality of copies for unique existence. So in other words, you go see these Rothko paintings in this chapel in Dallas. These original Rothko paintings have an aura that can't be copied in any reproduction that you might see of them. You have to go to the original because it has this ineluctable sense that must be experienced in its originality. But of course, in the future, we've developed a new aura detection technique. So next slide. And of course, this is Benjamin's actual ID card, an object itself that has an aura to it. As the irreducible and ineffable aspects of a distinct object with a particular history, the aura gives a painting, sculpture, or other aesthetic masterpiece a kind of animacy that draws the viewer into a singular exchange of intimate co-presence. In some motifs on Baudelaire, Benjamin wrote that, quote, "To perceive the aura of an object, we look at means to invest it with the ability to look at us in return." Next slide. Despite their mechanical nature, machine vision images force us to acknowledge how we see and are in turn seen by non-human agents. For example, a 2007 interactive artwork created by Sean Larson and Wafa Bilal revisits Manet's famed Abar at the Folies Bergère from 1881 to 82. By enabling the painting to incorporate the presence of the viewer,
using real-time compositing OpenGL through vision tracking algorithms. The computer determines the number and locations of viewers and stages the action accordingly. And this is from the description of the artwork. When they enter the space, viewers may notice the barmaid moving about and preparing for the evening. Viewers see themselves reflected in the mirror of the painting. The previous patron, seen in the upper right corner, leaves. The barmaid, if not already alive, comes to life. She refuses to offer service. If the barmaid is annoyed or tired, she will leave, only to return when everyone else leaves the space. The machine vision mirror generates the content that gives new meaning to the multiplicity of gazes and reflections in the initial work of art. And next slide. The initial machine vision experiments on auras were deployed for base financial reasons, as collectors tried to assess if objects had been in contact with famous figures from the historical past. eBay was an initial corporate sponsor because it recognized the cash value of the substantial market for memorabilia. After all, if Washington had slept there, a bed may be more valuable. Next slide. Wealthy donors from the Roman Catholic Church also contributed funds for aura research, because if a rosary had belonged to a noted saint, a relic might be more holy. Initially, researchers knew little about how the machine learning system was assigning value based on extrapolating from the training data of items with a known provenance. They theorized that much as chemical spectrography machines that analyze paintings could identify biological materials in the strata of the canvases, including skin residue and microscopic dots of saliva from the original painter, tiny amounts of genetic material were sloughing off onto objects in everyday use. Lost and found offices at airports and other transit hubs were some of the first to install the aura sensing machines. When police stations implemented use of the machines, they quickly transitioned from using the devices for lost objects to stolen objects. When portable models became available for street patrols, years of racial profiling was contradicted by the discovery that white, wealthy people were often kleptomaniacs. Strangely, the auras of the living proved much more potent than the auras of the dead. Oh, sorry, I'm a little... Yeah, that would be great. I have a little sweat in my eyes. Okay, I'm okay. Almost done. Strangely, the auras of the living proved to be much less potent than the auras of the dead, which disproved the biomatter hypothesis. Human rights workers found the machines to be extremely accurate in returning objects to the families of the victims of genocide. The museums at Auschwitz and other concentration camps were emptied, and museums around the world that had plundered grave items were forced to return them to descendants. This research linking temporal reverberation to aura intersected with a separate strand of research focused on the rhythm as the temporal echo. In the second machine vision workshop of the BSMV, Markham and Losh wrote a brief speculative essay on what would happen if data modeling focused exclusively on gestures, quote, riffing on the assumption that temporality is always the underlying dimension of algorithmic patterns, end quote. Their piece, which seems remarkably naive in retrospect, emerged from a dissatisfaction with a focus on objects endemic to the then popular stance of new materialism. They asked, quote, if data formats continue to fail and a future codex only focuses on gesture and video and images, how would that influence future digital heritage? Next slide. The question had been raised in part by Losh's mid-2010 interest in existing surveillance algorithms that tracked gait in pedestrians, studies of mobility and migratory species, and the Chinese pursuit of wide-scale machine recognition of all mobile agents, down to specific animals in the food supply, beginning with pigs. So this is actually a system that's in use in China that uses a combination of facial recognition and gait tracking to follow individual pigs in the food supply to avoid swine flu and other communicable diseases. And as part of Markham's studies around future memory and loss of future codexes for reading existing data formats. Next slide. Markham had been testing the temporal predictive features of algorithms in manipulating memory at a recent art exhibition, a multi-channel video installation, Glitch Memory, from 2018. Robert Oxcorn built a predictive algorithm to reduce a woman's narrative account of German occupation of Denmark to her hand gestures. And here you can see both the woman's hand gestures telling the story and the predictive algorithm that tries to figure out where her hands would go as she tells the story. Later that year, the Oxcorn algorithm was used for the first time in a Radiohead music video as a follow-up to their 2008 House of Cards video produced only using LiDAR. Crash of Meaning in 2021 ironically went unnoticed for years, even though it was the first clear demonstration of how sensors focused on the movement of hands and arms and later other bodily parts were picked up as traces of temporal echoes. These video glitches were largely dismissed as interference, algorithmic error, and infrared bleed. Analysis of the actual video shooting and production verified the ghosting in the video could not be connected to any of the band members' actual gestures. This led to analysis of other instances where the ghosting appeared. After all, by this point in human culture, people had become exhausted with the disciplining of the body by machine vision. Professional athletes were continuously scanned to make sure they maintained optimal poses. The judging of dance contests and ice skating competitions were no longer open to interpretation, as everything was automatically judged by sensorial arrays that fed data into the algorithmic processing that could judge an exceptional performance. Referees and arbiters disappeared from the world, and esports and e-dancing became the only sites of creativity and expression as players and actors improvised with algorithms that didn't normalize every aspect of movement. And if you've never seen some of these Cantina Crawls videos, which are created when people, it's machinima dance contests, essentially, where people are using computer algorithms to improvise in real time. Of course, we now give historical emphasis to the Oxcorn algorithm as the key element of this turning point. But we can also see a corollary thread as Losh and Markham continued to write about temporal echoes, as they turned from gesture to the broader study of both the staccato and wave patterns that played a role in the quality and perceived veracity of human interaction. As a historical side note, they were also responsible for the inept but sticky term human interaction to describe the human-entity interaction. Drawing on Kitchen's smart city discussion of the rhythm of the city, Pink's elaboration of sensory ethnography, Clausen's groundbreaking ethnography of ASMR, followed by Prophet and Krakauer's neurological pinpointing of the seventh sense aura, Losh and Markham published a landmark essay in Science, arguing that the locus of sensory perspective was radically mislocated. Using advancements from scientists at NASA and other space agencies attuned to the pulses of the universe, machine sensing technologies attuned to the rhythm of temporality detected waves still echoing from the time of the birth of the planet. People were astonished to hear the sound of Plato's voice in mundane interactions with other Athenian citizens, which was still echoing on the streets of the city, along with the sound of his footsteps and the sound of his breath. These wonders were in many ways less important than what humans ultimately learned from the machines that interpreted the environment through large neural networks, processing bigger and bigger sets of data. People learned about how it was intuition that ultimately made them human, and how their perceptions were much more about the analysis of information from any one sense. Thank you. Thank you for being such good-hearted listeners. I'm sorry that endurance performance with this warm weather. So, Stephanie. Okay.
So thanks so much. It's really, really rich a lecture. Thank you so much for this. So you proposed this aura detection machine learning system that can actually track the real aura and say if something is really not. Is the last part, is it like a manifesto that kind of is the outcome of your research of this science fiction project?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were interested in doing is there's a lot of paranoia about computer vision and a lot of fear. And I tend to think that people don't make good political decisions when they're primarily motivated by fear. I think instead we have to ask more complicated questions about what justice will mean for us in human society if we have a better understanding of what machines can and can't do. And, you know, the funny thing about all these different kinds of machine perception and the ways that they're given training data and have to sort of learn from that training data is that it allows us to actually understand much more about our own human, the sort of nebulousness and complexity of our own human learning. And maybe we can ask more substantive questions about that. Because I worry, yes, we should be afraid of self-driving cars, you know, running up onto the sidewalk and killing people. I mean, we should be worried about a complete lack of privacy in public space. But sort of with the work on aura and rhythm, we were kind of trying to think about what human perception is and what does it mean when you have a sort of sense of, like for example, people value these objects that are owned by famous people in the past, right? For some reason that has greater meaning to them. Like if you said, you know, this was a toothbrush once owned by your grandmother, right? You're going to value that toothbrush more because you have this sense of its connection to this person, even though it's a completely illogical feeling. And we want to kind of, in some ways, give that feeling some validation. Does that make sense?
So kind of this deep learning will mirror us a kind of legitimacy of our own fuzziness.
Yes. Yeah. The human irrationality, once machine learning gets good enough and can kind of imitate that irrationality rather than that rationality, that might open up certain possibilities. It's kind of a, you know, it is a kind of manifesto, but it's done in the form of this science fiction media theory work.
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for this journey really through aisles of perspectives on vision and how it is shaped by technology and or other actors. And maybe this would be my question. If you look at status quo today, where do you see the main actors or agents shaping technology plus vision today? Because you showed artworks, many artworks actually as an example. But I know that your research very much also goes to day-to-day basis usage of technology, so maybe you can say where that goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there are a number of different kinds of gatekeepers who are seeing themselves as stakeholders in this process. So when I actually go to machine vision conferences periodically, and I have to say one thing is that they are dominated by men. So there was one time that I showed up at a machine vision conference, and one of the organizers came up to me and said, "Mary!" And I said, "Liz." And I mean, clearly there was only one woman he was waiting for as a registered participant in the conference. So the fact that there were two, he had sort of slipped his mind.
Who is going to machine vision conferences?
All white men.
But what are their professions?
So mostly computer scientists, but it's interesting to see the other people who go to these conferences. So the fact that there are a lot of people from state security agencies, and not just from the US, but also from governments that cooperate with the United States. So if you go to these conferences in North America, there will be people not only from US security agencies, but also from Britain and Canada and other places. So they're an important, because they're interested in how to use these technologies at airports and other kinds of public places. Then you see cultural heritage people. And they have the least money to do work with this, but they know that they have, so for example, large image collection, as museums get together and have these very large databases of images. They're trying to figure out ways to curate this information more accurately because they might have incorrect or incomplete records. So they're there. And then the third group is sort of the kind of culture industry people who want to protect intellectual property. So they want to use machine vision in order to make sure that copyrighted works aren't out on the internet without paying proper licensing fees. So they're also participating in this research. So it's kind of a weird mix of people who, you don't often see museum directors and people from spy agencies and people from the movie industry all hanging out together with a bunch of computer scientists. They have this challenge called TrekVid. They have actually a bunch of different challenges where the idea is that you pick video on YouTube and you try to classify it in the most accurate way, and they compete against each other. So university computer science teams talk about their TrekVid scores, because that's their ability to identify material using machine vision in the wild.
But and then to come back to this, those are people seeing images at the moment, but who are the ones shaping what an image is today?
Well, I would say that actually those people are shaping what the algorithms are looking for. So they're looking for terrorists and dissidents. They're looking for shoplifters and thieves. They're looking for copyright violations and appropriation of cultural materials. I mean, so they're imagining a potential offender, a potential wrongdoer. And I think that shapes the design of the algorithms in certain ways.
Anyone with a question? Yeah.
I heard that also NGOs try to be part of the game. For example, one that wanted to classify or find out cluster bombs. In lots and lots and thousands of private videos they had, and it would have taken a lifetime to check all of them. And so they tried to kind of teach the algorithm to identify these bombs. Mm-hmm. So I think
I think that
which is quite tricky because they can't let the bomb explode, but they had to just build a kind of artificial bomb.
Yeah, and there is work also done by human rights groups trying to use some of these. That's why I wanted to show the Lozano-Hemmer when they're looking for the missing students as an example, because there are cases where they're looking for people who have been victims of state violence.
Well, that's another technical thing, because I've been trying to find out about these fairs where only military goes, or like cybersecurity, like the high end of each state. And I found an expo in London, in December, but I'm still wondering because it looks quite open to the public, as I could go there, I could make, it looks like I could go there, but I don't really believe that this is the high end. Have you got of these fairs? Because I can't imagine that I'm there standing next to the highest level of decision maker of a military commander or something. You know what I mean?
Yes, and
because it's hard to find out.
But I was shocked though when I went to SenseTime, which they're racially profiling ethnic Uyghurs in China right now. right? And which is, anyone who thinks about the Nazi past, that kind of ethnic profiling for, political reasons by a nation state that has ideas about racial normality, like that's certainly a concerning thing. But when I went to their lab, they were remarkably proud of their accomplishments. Now, of course, you're not going to necessarily hear how the algorithm is being, that those high stakes conversations, yes, you're not going to be there. But the weird thing is universities have partnered closely with Sense. So SenseTime has a close relationship with MIT. And there's a kind of multi-million-dollar funds transfer moving back and forth between researchers at MIT. It's the company is based in Hong Kong, but their training data actually largely comes from the People's Republic of China. And they have a second office in Singapore, which is also very interested in automated policing because, Singapore is a highly surveillance-oriented state. But what's interesting is that they also then have these partnerships with US universities. So they're actually working with computer vision researchers in the United States who are receiving funds in order to develop these technologies. And SenseTime so they gave me this whole like PowerPoint presentation spiel, like I was some sort of, instead of being an academic researcher, like I was a potential investor. It was really weird. And they bragged they have collaborations with Google, with Cisco, with a lot of technology companies as well. So even though they're doing this terrible ethnic profiling work that's affecting dissidents in China, they're also working with all of these US Silicon Valley companies and US universities.
So you're suggesting that usual citizen has more or less the same access?
No.
No.
But you can still, because there are bragging rights about accuracy. So the thing that these companies are obsessed with now is accuracy. And they compete to see who can be most accurate. And university researchers are kind of part of the participating community. So because these contests are highly competitive and somewhat open, you can find out certain things about how these algorithms are being refined. Does that make some sense?
I'd love to attend such a fair or such a presentation, but I haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, I worry that the one I used to go to, which was Digital Media Analysis and something, it's spelled DMASM, they don't seem to be offering any anymore, so I wonder if they've changed to a new name.
Sorry, is there a question maybe popping up? Because maybe I can add to me and you going to those conferences, but and to come back to what is the role of art in relation to this? Is there any kind of agency there?
There's a huge amount of agency. In fact, one thing that was funny about when I was at UC San Diego was I had a friend who was a computer scientist who studied security. And he was studying those scanners that you go through in airports. And he was joking about, so, he basically does experiments where he tries to bring weapons through the scanners. And he said, you guys maybe don't want to know this, but apparently it's very easy to trick the algorithms of the machine. And he wanted to partner with an artist to sort of do some sort of installation on that. And so I was sort of suggesting a dozen different visual artists who might be interested in that kind of work. Because I do think that sometimes artists can help raise public awareness. And I think particularly sometimes things that involve either empathy or humor can be very important.
Also in shifts of the sensible, like in ways of shifts of what is there to be seen.
Mm-hmm. And I think popular culture can be important. I don't know if the show Black Mirror is popular here at all in Austria, but it's very popular in the United States. And that show, which is about social media surveillance of various kinds, actually does promote public discussions and greater human literacy. So I think art has a big role. I think the thing I worry most about is, I'm not an artist, I'm a humanist. Right? My job is primarily to be a kind of theorist or commentator. I worry that people don't seem very interested in these questions in the traditional humanities. And artists have actually been much better.
Okay. I think it's actually funny because in the traditional Muslim countries, there was no one had the permission to do images, right? It's not allowed to make an image, and that's why, I don't know, there's a lot of calligraphy that looks like an image in the end, but it's still writing. And for us as European view, okay, it was always ridiculous, right? That you have not an allowance to make an image. But I think in the end, their argument was, yeah, because only God has the objective truth to make an image, and humans should not tackle that objective truth. And actually now they are right, because that's what happened now, that imagery has become such a ubiquitous and most important input. Okay, you said there are also other senses, but mostly visuals. It's an objective truth that is kind of misused. People can, with 99%, maybe make a prediction or think that they can make a prediction. And this is definitely something that is now used as an excuse by the Chinese government, for example, to say, yeah, we have the numbers, and then do something totally irrational, like this person is a political enemy, so they are excluded of society. I just thought it's funny that it became true, this prophecy of the Muslim Bilderverbot, I don't know how you call it, permission of pictures, making an image.
Yeah, that's sort of what we were trying to do in thinking about this idea of optical nostalgia. Is that there might be a certain Eurocentrism built into what we assume visual culture means.
Thank you. If I understood you right, you said that these techniques are used to, like, from official side, used to prevent cultural appropriation. What do you mean by that? Was the first question. And the second is that you said in the airport the scans want to determine gender. Why do they want to do that?
Because they're trying to, so in looking for weapons, they want to, they assume that the sort of external genitalia need to be taken into account when thinking about someone potentially hiding explosives in their clothing. And so they make a visual determination about someone's gender in order to calibrate the machine to look for the weapons. And of course, that creates all sorts of complexities in airports because whether or not you have external genitalia is not something that's normally very important in people's day-to-day lives. So it creates all sorts of disruptions for people who are transgender people, for example, going through those detections.
Also, there is the legal option of not specifying your gender to either male or female in Austria, for example.
But to use the machines, they're calibrated either way, so you have to opt out of the machine and get a pat down, physical pat down. So you're essentially your genitals will be touched if you choose not to go through identify a gender and go through the machine. So, and to the first question, so the question about cultural appropriation is interesting in terms of how machine vision could be used. I was mostly talking about intellectual property and copyright violations. And so looking for, people sharing things on the web that they might not have legal rights to, so music or images or moving images. There's a lot of money actually going into machine vision and machine hearing technologies to try to automatically detect that content on the web. But I think thinking about using machine vision for cultural appropriation is a great thing to think about, particularly with things like cultural appropriation and the fashion industry, like the way that they take textiles from indigenous cultures and use them without permission.
Sorry, some other question? I mean, I have one more. It's about refusing to be identified or to be put into a register. There are also subversive strategies, maybe. So what's on the table as for this?
All kinds of things. There's makeup that you can put on your face that makes it hard for You can also misidentify yourself. I recommend, whenever possible, have yourself called a different name or change your age or change your gender. Like the more that we cloud the data, the less those algorithms can judge us. I found myself, a couple of weeks ago, I was rereading parts of Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt's book, and she's talking about how, she argues that when people in Jewish ghettos agreed to these record-keeping protocols and agreed to be, identified, that made it much easier to deport them. And so, I think these moments of historical refusal and potential refusal to be part of a database can be really important. The problem is, our society sets it up so that being part of a database makes life more friction-free, right? You could open your door with your face. You can open your phone with your face. You can get on a cruise ship with your face. And that's only going to become more true. It's going to become harder and harder to just get into your bank account with your PIN code. Because, inevitably, these authentication systems will be more widely used.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for illuminating so many things around machine vision and vision today, or contemporary vision practices. I think we maybe make a break there. Mm-hmm. It's very hot. There is some program up for everybody who hasn't been there in the beginning to follow up now on this, which is a workshop by the community college, actually more on the topic of games and of identifying rules or maybe also patterns, and how we can teach each other, maybe also on getting more open-minded or flexible in understanding rules that are up there, also informal rules. So whoever wants to stay is very much invited to stay, but I think we make at least a 15-minute break now, I think. So what time is it now? It's 5. So 5:15, I would invite everybody to gather together again here, and then we decide also collectively on how much efforts and we are up for today in this hot day. Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Thank you very much.